least.
Do you see it?
I want to thank you for being here. We're a somewhat smaller, but a perfectly formed audience. And we really appreciate your staying with us through what's been a very rich but also very long series of days for our people. It will be a lively event. It's a bit of an experiment as we've decided to move away from the kind of standard Academy Awards format. Although I have to say that if this were the Academy Awards, then the Dutch would, I think, be the equivalent of the Titanic. And this was an observation made by Sally Wyatt. We have an over-representation from the Netherlands, but I just wanted to say these decisions were made totally independently, and they're
See if it doesn't like
very well deserved. We took no bribes.
Doesn't seem to be changing anything. You hear this, but nothing.
Okay, try.
Test, 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 test. You still hear me, right? The gain's all the way down, but I don't know why you still hear me.
As Lucy says, we're trying to move away from the rather formalised sealed envelope on Wednesday's very long thanks. Emotion and tears, we don't. And we're going to have the presenters of the awards and the recipients of the awards on the platform. We'll hear a short presentation about each award.
I'm not getting the board at all. I'm getting this.
Contribution is. And then we're going to ask the recipients to work for their award by actually sharing observation, question and interacting with each other. So that's that. So can I start?
I can hear that just fine. Sometimes I use a shotgun and we have a field.
We get it. We'll figure it out. So you can hear me.
You can hear that.
Okay, so can we start with Kelly Moore presenting the Fleck Prize, please?
Hear the shotgun in both ears.
Okay.
It's a real pleasure to be here this evening representing the Fleck Prize Committee for 2015. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Roland Ball, Wen Pak Kuo, and Vivian Lodgeson for their hard work on this prize committee. I'm delighted to introduce the Fleck Prize winner for this year, Ghost Stories for Darwin, The Science of Variation and the Politics of Diversity, as you can see, by Banu Subramanian of the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the USA. This book offers a narrative that winds as intricately as the morning glory flowers that she studies as an evolutionary biologist. Ghost Stories for Darwin engages feminist STS, histories of science, and the myriad efforts to include women as knowledge makers to confront the ghosts of racism and sexism that have limited how, who, and what can be known. Subramanian refuses the constraints of genre and discipline that have contributed to these exclusions.
to say again on behalf of the Flat Prize Committee, congratulations on a spectacularly interesting and important book.
Could I now ask Estrid Sorensen to present the answer?
I'm very happy on behalf of the Council of East to present the winner of the Danska Award 2016. The Danska Award is given for a significant creative and collaborative contribution in an edited volume or special issue in the broad field of science and technology studies. The prize 2016, is giving to an edited volume edited by Eden Medina, Ivan da Costa Marquez, and Christina Holmes with the title Beyond Imported Magic, Essays on Science, Technology and Society in Latin America. Through a series of fascinating case studies and historical analysis, Beyond Imported Magic provide insight into science and technology and into science and technology studies. Scientists, communities, and environments, and how they create, adapt, develop, use, and indeed live. Was to Latin America and adapted in those circulations. The Danska Award is not only given for a original and innovative contribution to the field, it's very much beyond important magic has been developed over a series of workshops among colleagues in Latin America and beyond, and also involving more people through call for papers to the book. We also expect, however, that it's not only the production of the book that has provided, or what's called, being catalyzer for collaboration in Latin America and beyond, but that the book as a finished product will indeed be community building and seek to be an icon for the Latin American STS community, which is indeed emerging. It is, of course, as representative from a European Association for Science and Technology Studies, particularly and a particular acknowledgement from our side to realize that several of the authors and editors have a background in European institutions or are still working or affiliated with European value for European STS scholars is to challenge prevailing concepts and methodologies through actively listening to what, from our perspectives, may be called different experiences.
Okay, I suggest the recipients stay at the table together, and could I ask Banu to share some thoughts?
Yes. First of all, thank you very much. I'm very, very honored. And we've been chatting before, and it, I think, struck all of us that this is the year of the non-modern. We are celebrating ghosts and magic. And I think all of us are very thrilled here, doing that. And I think what interests me about you is how you would characterize magic and the importance of magic in SDS and why we should pay attention to it. And that's what I loved about your book.
Well, I think magic will stop to be rejected as false or fake and radically separated from truth. On the other hand, it's hard for me to think of purified methodologies or epistemologies of especially singled out disciplines as general tools for knowledge construction in a non-Western and non-modern world. I'm not saying that some methodological and epistemological tests of force will always be absent. I think that specialists will continue to exist. They are good and they make special and. But I don't think that disciplines, as they are understood today, will exist in a non-modern, non-Western world. The authority of the specialist will be crucially transformed and explicitly restricted to frameworks. So truth will not be established in the realm of a specialist's rationality only. Our book shows that already happens in Latin America, but in fact that happens already everywhere. In occasions that science is not able to provide a good solution, people abandon science.
I think we agree. I think ghosts don't like disciplines either.
Banu, one of the things that I found interesting about your book in comparison with our book, and I love that we're discussing ghosts and magic. I think that's just wonderful. But you start your book with a frustration about ghosts. Right? You talk how you grew up with ghosts and how you were frustrated with that narrative and you went to seek solace in science and then you discovered the value in those ghost stories, right? So you started off rejecting and then kind of came back and accepting. At least for me and how I got into this project, there was an embrace of magical realism, right? As a way that is a way that we can understand Latin America's past. So if I were to put together a history of technology syllabus on Latin America, for example, I would include Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. I think that is a wonderful history of technology and can be read from that way. But also a frustration, right? That Latin America has to be understood as more than that. And in fact, there are literary movements that have been rejecting magical realism and instead opting for more emphasis on hybrid cultures, consumerism, high-tech mixed with low-tech, et cetera. And so at first I thought that we started from very different places, but in the end we kind of ended up in the middle, right? Kind of embracing and rejecting at the same time. And I thought that was very interesting. I also found it interesting that we both drew from more diverse kinds of materials and how we were conceptualizing the work. So perhaps it's not a coincidence that we're talking about ghosts and magic.
So that both associations,
Yes.
converged on the same.
Yes.
And I like very much your metaphor of ghosts that resonates with magic in the sense of carrying mysteries and opening up imaginaries. Your book has a very useful and crucially political message. Variations happens in the world. Ghosts are hidden ontological operators that act in translating pre-scientific variations into scientifically reduced differences from which diversity hides their political options. Identifying ghosts into a crucial task that is performed in inseparably historical Buster. I cannot be successful unless I believe now, in contemporary times, that the woman is the future of man. Am I right?
I am imagining a world in the future where we don't have sex and gender. So I would prefer not to think in those terms. But I agree with you in terms of the ways in which I'm using the ghosts. And in part, it is the tradition of India. And for me, growing up with Bollywood films where ghosts are often unhappy people who have been harmed by history. And so in the, middle, a ghost will come, usually breaking into song in the, middle of fog and mist. And so so the happy ghosts go away to a happy place. So it's only the unhappy ghosts that remain to talk about injustice and the problem. And they always only meet curious people who are likely to listen to them. So right? And so a part of what I was arguing in that work is of using it as an allegory for the kind of epistemology and the kind of openness we need to have about disciplines.
Yeah. Good. Look, thank you. I think we're all very conscious that both of these books, I was pleased you shared, started with a frustration at the dominant narrative. And I'm intrigued at the commitment and energy to decide to actually not just complain about it, but to construct something different. And I think both of you have done a fantastic job in that respect. So we're going to have to draw that little session to a close. And thank you all very much. So could I now ask the presenters and recipients of the 4S Infrastructure Award and the East Freeman Award come up onto the platform, please? Okay, good. Could I ask Kenji Ito to introduce the Infrastructure Award, please?
Infrastructure is everywhere now. So much has been studied. The idea of this new prize, STS Infrastructure Award, is to use a little bit of reflexivity and to pay more attention to the infrastructure work in STS itself and honor individuals and other entities for their contribution to such relatively invisible and often unrecognized effort, which we could perhaps call STS by other means. On behalf of the STS Infrastructure Award Committee, co-chaired by Jeffrey Bauker and myself, it is a great pleasure to present the very first award to WTMC, the Netherlands Graduate School of Science, Technology, and Modern Culture. Okay, the full citation is on the website, so I'll try to be very short. WTMC is a truly remarkable, exemplary infrastructure work built across many Dutch universities. Over 3 decades, WTMC has been bringing together PhD students in STS across the Netherlands and beyond. It has been building cohorts of STS scholars through the workshops and the summer schools. One of the remarkable aspects of WTMC is that it is a trans-institutional endeavor. This means at least 2 things. The first, it is a collaborative project across institutional borders. They collaborate rather than compete with each other, which is something. And also the second, those who work for WTMC play a role beyond normally expected roles within their home institutions, with which most of us are very too busy to do anything else. So I am hoping these things perhaps gives some common ground for the conversation which should follow. Okay.
Then could I ask Cara van Lente to introduce the Freeman Award?
I'm happy to announce on behalf of the East Council the Freeman Award 2016. And the Freeman Award is for a publication which is a significant collective contribution to the interaction of science and technology studies and the study of innovation. And for this year, The award is for the edited volume, the new production of users, changing innovation collectives and involvement strategies. And the 3 editors are Samsa Husalo, Torben Elgard Jensen and Nelly Oudshoorn. We think the volume produces an outstanding contribution to the interface of STS and innovation studies. It first of all provides a timely renewal of studies of user innovation. It takes stock of the different perspectives, and in an interesting way it brings it to a new level. It also discusses how user innovation is associated with democratization, but also broader. It can also relate to broader issues like illegal situations and controversies and conflicts. In doing so, and that is the 3rd contribution, the volume brings a novel research agenda on users in innovation. It succeeds in deepening the analysis and brings the strengthening of the study of users in innovation dynamics. So to summarize, this volume is an excellent and opportune illustration of the cross-fertilization between STS and innovation studies. It is awarded the Freeman Prize 2016.
Okay, Sally, share some thoughts with us.
Thank you very much. Right, folks. As you've just heard, and as Nelly certainly knows, one of the kind of core activities of WTMC is to provide training for new PhD students and workshops, summer schools, and what have you. And we have this famous core list of literature on which we have wonderful STS texts that we think PhDs should read. So my question for you really is, should we put your book on the core list? And why? What would WTMC PhDs need to understand about the new production of users, and how would your book inform them?
Sally, this is supposed to be a conversation, not a PhD vibe.
Do you first want to go for yes or no?
No, first yes, all of us. Of course. That's my contribution.
Yeah, I guess the message, does this work? Yeah. I guess the message of the book and why it should be on the list is fourfold. Could be condensed into sort of 4 observations. Well, the first thing that really has changed in the last 20 or so years is that user involvement is no longer something which is exceptional or empowering maverick activity, but it has become sort of fact of life. Users have significant productive capabilities and they're exercised very widely in society. And the second point what we try to put forward in this volume is that this hasn't really gone unnoticed. So what we see is these increasing efforts to produce productive users by managers, designers, by other users and peers. And so the landscape has changed quite dramatically since the users were sort of first flagged in the previous volumes on users at the turn of the millennium. And this then links back to sort of core STS concerns that whilst user inclusion in innovation, in design, was almost by necessity associated with empowerment, by inclusion, this isn't necessarily the case anymore. This can happen, but it doesn't happen by default. And so we need to start asking new questions to understand how users can really shape technologies when they are simply co-opted, or what sort of more complex configurations emerge, because users are no longer naive themselves. They are gaming the designers, the managers, and vice versa. So we are looking at this sort of series of configurational movements rather than mere configuring or reconfiguring.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
I was going to ask Samsa to give you one back in return, actually. Okay.
I would be very happy to. So WTMC, acronyms which you don't understand what they really stand for in another language are
Science, technology, and modern culture.
yes, I can.
Okay.
Yeah, but VTMC doesn't quite map to that, does it?
This is when you all break into dance, folks.
Yeah. It's an infrastructure, and our Dutch contributors in the volume talk about, do interesting and important work on the work that goes into infrastructure. So do you first want to say something about what kind of work to support the infrastructure that just one award has gone into? Can you open the hood, so to say?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a nice kind of segue into this kind of picture, which probably none of you can see. And I hope I haven't forgotten anyone. And some of the pictures are a bit old. But I think the important thing, WTMC is an enormous kind of collective effort of a lot of people over many, many years. And I mean, not all of the members are up there. What I hope I've captured are all the coordinators, all the directors, all the previous chairs of the board, Hani Sprong, who does a lot of the administration, and the incredibly impossible to find a photo of Marietta Campiani, but her name is there. I managed to get her name in there. I know she is very an invisible infrastructure, and some people think she's an avatar, but she isn't. But I think there is a lot of infrastructural work that does support VTMC, and I think in different kinds of ways. First of all, we hold a lot of our events in a repurposed Catholic convent. So there's all that earlier work of the Catholic Church that helps. There's the wonderful work of the Dutch infrastructure system, which when you take trains every day, you sometimes complain about. But in the grand scheme of things, Dutch railways are actually incredibly good, and Dutch public transport is very good, which makes it possible for kind of people to get together. As Kenji already alluded to, all universities kind of participate in WTMC, and we do this as a collaborative thing, and most of us do it most of the time with very little compensation, just for the kind of love of the field and bringing people together. And in these days of competition, that's, I think, a remarkable achievement. And then finally, I think it's not just the Dutch. I mean, I could say we're all Dutch now, but it is the whole community that's here today with 4S and East also makes it possible by, as anchor teachers at the summer school, contributing lectures at other kinds of events, all of your kind of wonderful work, and sending your own students to us. So I think this really is a kind of wonderful kind of, I'm very happy with this prize because I think it does recognize a lot of infrastructural work by many, many people.
Okay, you're allowed your follow-up. You're allowed your follow-up now to Samsa.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. Okay. You were talking about, okay, users might get co-opted, users are also learning to game the system. So what kind of, is user still a useful word? Are there other kinds of identities, subjectivities, roles that we could kind of think about for people, and other ways in which people can be empowered?
Yes. No, this is not
scripted. We didn't plan that question.
Yeah, this is not scripted anymore. So having written about, I guess all of us have written about for about a decade on how reductivist and horrible word user is, right? It continues to be this lingua franca, which is very hard to annihilate anywhere. And meanwhile, doing this, it at some point occurred to me that there are these other kinds of relational terms out there. Like, I don't necessarily feel myself a patient apart from when I'm in a hospital. I don't. When one of our colleagues were studying us, I didn't really feel like a native, but yeah, I was. He was American. He was studying energy research in Finland, so I was one of his natives. These are all relational terms, and so user happens to be quite exact sort of relational term to describe
of the increased and increasingly individuated surveillance that modern technology makes possible. Do such metaphors conceal more than they reveal? Whitney fears that they do, and argues for a more ontological approach that emphasizes the different realities that can be imagined through these new forms of data collection, including the realities experienced by the animals themselves. The payoff of this, and the relevance for STS more widely, is the argument that our accounts are also interventions, and that the choices we make about how to theorize our data have implications for what those we study, in Christopher's words, were, are, and can be. So thanks, congratulations at a distance to Christopher.
We now move to the 4S Bernal Prize. Could I ask Uli and Mike to come up to the platform? So Uli's going to make the presentation of this award, and then we're going to have a conversation between Lucy and Mike.
So, tonight I have a special honor and pleasure to introduce this year's Bernal Prize winner, Mike Lynch. I'm speaking in the name of the Bernal Prize committee members, besides myself, Paul Edwards, Joan Fujimura, and Alan Irvin. And I hope I translate what we all discussed. Our task had to be to look out for a candidate who has made, along his academic life, I quote, a distinguished contribution to the field. Let me say it shortly, the selection process did not turn out to be very complex, as we quickly and unanimously agreed on our, if I may say so, candidate. Let me share why we think that Mike more than merits this recognition. Michael Lynch has indeed an impressive and long-term and highly influential contribution to science and technology studies and to the intellectual life of 4S as a society, and well beyond, I do think. Let me give you a flavor of what guided us towards this decision. Trained in ethnomethodology, Mike's early work would turn out to be central to the development of the laboratory study, something we take for granted today in STS as part of our historical development. It was his focus on ordinary action which has profoundly shaped the field. Mike has extended and developed the now widespread usage of ethnographic and ethnomethodological approaches within S2S. This, we thought, was perfectly complemented by his long-standing interest in scientific visualizations. He has significantly contributed to bringing our attention to what was then an often neglected area. Next to his papers, the co-edited volume Representation in Scientific Practice, which has been re-edited, has made a great job in drawing together different perspectives on that topic and in furthering our sensibilities to the issues. This could be complemented by his work on evidence, the DNA fingerprinting, which has really a convincing part, this kind of respect for the empirical detail with a strong sense of conceptualization. But we should also appreciate that along the way, he has also produced a number of papers, some being very nicely provocative. And I think one is very nicely fitting to the Barcelona venue, the one that is on science as a vacation. Nothing better. It is a vacation. Whoever thinks it's something else, that's totally wrong. Unsettling and challenging conventional STS assumptions like against reflectivity is, to my view, something a field like ours really needs. Mike is a distinctive and committed scholar who has raised the intellectual standing of STS and helped bring new generations into the field. He has played many important roles within 4S, not least as the president of the association. And if I'm allowed a little side remark, I will always remember your impressive presidential presentation in 2009 in the Washington Hotel at Halloween. I won't say more than that. Those who have been there will know it. And in STS more generally. He made an exceptional contribution in his 10-year period of editor in Social Studies of Science, with countless colleagues benefiting from his sharp yet constructive commentaries. Again, a small personal note. When publishing in SSS under Mike's editorship, he meticulously deconstructed my love for passive voice sentences, trying to chase even the tiniest little Germanism, which I try to keep alive. I admired him for this energy and perseverance. He really picked the last bits that I had hoped he would overlook. Don't worry, Mike, today I won't speak about all the other feelings I had about the process. And finally, he has been one of the editors of the third edition of the handbook, which is, I guess, some work, I might say, for the field. So, Mike, let me congratulate you for this year's Bernal Prize.
Okay, so this section of our program is going to take the form of a conversation between the two of us. And Mike and I go back quite a ways. So I thought that I would begin with our common coming of age in the 1970s and the 1980s under the influence of ethnomethodology. I think that's the appropriate phrase. For example, I'm thinking about your early collaborations with Harold Garfinkel and Eric Livingston in papers like The Work of a Discovering Science, which was published in 1981 in the Journal of Philosophy of the Social Sciences, and also Temporal Order and Laboratory Work, published in 1983 in the collection Science Observed. And then, of course, your own PhD dissertation, published in 1985 as Art and Artifact in Laboratory Science. And so I thought I'd ask you to just talk about this early connection between ethnomethodology and science studies and how you think about that.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I'll start with how I got into science and technology studies. I began working towards the PhD at UC Irvine in 1972. At that time, STS wasn't a field as we know it now, and the School of Social Sciences at UC Irvine had no departments. It was a recently formed university, and James March, a very well-known organization theorist, was an early dean who was an architect of this non-disciplinary school. The idea for this was that there would be cross-disciplinary or non-disciplinary clusters formed, and that this would develop innovations that don't fit within the boundaries of organizations, within departments. I understand from Alan Irwin that the Copenhagen Business School, where we had the last 4S East conference, also was influenced by March's hand. It was a short-lived experiment at UCI, but it was ideal for, at least for a time, for ethnomethodology and conversation analysis. And it would be for STS had it existed at the time in that school. Harold Garfinkel was visiting there. His normal position was at UCLA, and during my first year, and he was developing what he called studies of work in the sciences and professions. And one of the animating rubrics of that was that the social sciences, and particularly sociology, studied many activities: music, religion, the other arts, science, of course, and medicine, many topics, but often they left out the details of the practices, and he called that the missing what of work practices. So play music, police investigation, medical practices, diagnosis, laboratory shop work were things that were consigned to the disciplines themselves or the practices themselves, and not of much interest to sociology. My ethnography of a neurosciences laboratory started in about 1974 and 5, and I began without knowledge of the strong program at Edinburgh and SSK as it was developing elsewhere, like University of York and University of Bath. I only later became aware that Bruno Latour, Steve Woolgar, Karen Knorr, and Sharon Traweek were also doing ethnographic studies in California. I did become aware of them by the time I completed drafting my dissertation in 1978, and I had met and read many authors by the time I finished. The common agenda with David Bloor was his very famous line that he wanted to propose to investigate the very nature and content of science, which had been consigned to philosophy and specialized methodology. So to answer your question briefly, ethnomethodological studies of work in science and mathematics began independently from the new sociology of scientific knowledge that formed in the 1970s and developed through the 80s and beyond. But both reacted to a lack of attention in the social sciences to material performances, and differences remained with constructivism, actor network theory, the strong program, and so forth, and I've written about that, but there was a strong convergence on that core issue at the time.
Okay, great. So then in the late 80s and early 90s, you had a series of publications that I've drawn on very gratefully in my own work. Maybe most notably your 1988 paper, The Externalized Retina, which many of us know, published in Human Studies. Then you went on to do the book Representation in Scientific Practice with Steve Woolgar, and the recently revisited version of that with Steve, Caitlin Koopmans, and Janet Vertesi. And then your book, Scientific Practice in Ordinary Action. And I just want to quote briefly from that and then pose a question. So you write, as soon as the statements with quotes associated with the various natural sciences, the utterances, speeches, equations, writings, citations, and other documents collected in the archives are recollected and placed in semiotic schemes, stable representations of historical lineages and semantic networks, social, historical, and ethnographic narratives, cognitive maps, and so forth, they become dissociated from the varieties of the deeds that give them their life. I really love that quote, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the implications of that observation for STS. What should we take from that for our own work?
Okay. Let me go back a bit to sort of the background of that. It began with a preoccupation with what I called rendering practices, which in the laboratory I studied was a matter of turning laboratory animals into data displays of brain plasticity. The animal did not survive the ordeal. Ethnomethodology and conversation analysis have an attunement to spatio-temporal and sequential organization, and I transpose that to these embodied and instrumental practices with animals. This is in contrast to the overwhelming preoccupation with the correspondence between signs and reference in philosophy and through many of the social sciences. I also, in some ways, did a kind of integration of Foucault and Garfinkel on two related issues of docile bodies from Foucault and the docile object from Garfinkel as what was rendered through these processes into data displays. It was a matter of, as well, of identifying, taking account of, and cleaning out artifacts such as deposits of stains or perceived distortions of the shape of things from the practices of ultramicroscopic preparation. I called that an archaeology of artifacts, an archaeology that was done by me as well as by the practitioners that reveals the form of life as they attempt to try to negatively deal with these things. So there was an inversion between the distaste for artifacts of those sorts by the scientists and my intensive interest in them. In 1981, there was a meeting at l'École des Mines in Paris. I already knew Latour and some of the others by then, and Latour, John Law, Francois Bastide, Karen Norsatina, and some very interesting people like Samuel Edgerton, who was an artist, a historian of art and science, were there. That conference and those relationships attuned me more closely to inscription, paper, graphics than I had been previously. And I also integrated that with the theme of the mathematization of nature that comes out of Edmund Husserl. Now, the idea there was that the data and their mathematical and graphic properties are impressed into the world from which the data are extracted. Now, the quote you read was a very long sentence, right? But let me draw 2 points from it. One, I think is quite familiar and in line with notions of constructivism and whatever has followed after it, and objectification in social science, and that is that data are not the starting point for analysis, either by the scientists or by us, and that they're tentative outcomes of collectively performed, interactionally contingent, and instrumentally mediated practices. The second thing is that post hoc interpretations of the textual products of such practices cannot recover such work. It's not just a matter of tacit knowledge, because the contingencies of practical action are not any body's knowledge. They're formed collectively, and they're not abstract in the way that we think of knowledge.
Great. Okay, so we're almost out of time. And I had 2 more questions I was going to ask. I was going to ask you next about the work that you've been doing on questions of truth and the politics of evidence, the numeropolitics of counting, your collaborations with Simon Cole and Ruth McNally and Kathleen Jordan in Truth Machine. So that was going to be an invitation to talk about where you're heading. But I'd also really like to ask you in our final 3 minutes about all of your editorial work, because so many of us are so deeply indebted to your editorial service to STS scholarship as basically a decade of being the editor of Social Studies of Science, the third handbook. So can you just talk a little bit about how you think about that kind of service work as part of your scholarly life?
Okay. I had a long question. Long answer to the last question.
We'll
I have a short one to this one.
Okay, we'll publish
okay.
the long
Great.
question answer
so
on
I'll do the short and sweet one.
Website.
Okay. First of all, I have to acknowledge David Edge's exemplary editorship of Social Studies of Science from the time it was formed. He was co-editor with Roy McDowell. What was it? Roy. Bleh, blocking his name. Anyway, David was more important. And
the other guy, we don't think
Roy
he's
McLeod.
Here, so.
Roy McLeod. Okay.
Okay.
So senior moment. Sorry. That's what you get with the Burnell Prize. Anyway, I'm not supposed to acknowledge people, but David Edge deserves an acknowledgement, because not only did he found that journal, and also was the first director of the Science Studies unit at Edinburgh that just recently celebrated its 50th anniversary. He did editing in a very unique way, inimitable way. I couldn't follow his total activities as an editor in person. He devoted tremendous care and attention not only to the products of writing, but to the people who were involved. And he kind of implicitly tutored me on this for a period of time as a collaborating editor. And some of the collaborating editors I worked with too, particularly Steve Chapin, were very helpful for my lifelong effort to wean myself of the idioms that I learned from Harold Garfinkel. So
it's a big rehabilitation there, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm still damaged, but but what I learned from him and through the practice of writing is that editing, not only as a journal editor, but with my students and myself, is a matter of working with content as well as grammatical form. You can't do miracles with it. No ghosts. It's pretty material work. But there's from this working with sentence by sentence kind of editorial work. There's a self-tutorial that cultivates writing as well as with recipients. And I'm also glad to see that Sergio Sismondo for the last 3 years has, or now it's 4 years, has been carrying on with that tradition.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we could all have enjoyed continuing listening to that, but time presses. I'm handing over to Lucy now, who will be chairing the rest of the session.
Okay, so now I would like to ask Claire Waterton and Shobita Parasathi to come up as our next presenters, and of course Gabrielle Hecht and Monami Badra to join them. Okay, so I'm going to start by asking Shobita to talk about the Mullins Prize.
Great, thank you very much, Lucy. On behalf of the Mullins Prize Committee, which was chaired by Tanya Perez Bustos, Daniel Breslau, and Kelly Owens, I'm delighted to present the 2016 Mullins Prize today. The Mullins Prize is awarded for an outstanding piece of scholarship in the field of science and technology studies, authored by a graduate student. We read 22 papers that were diverse both geographically and in terms of gender, and we evaluated those papers according to their contribution to the STS field, the depth of research, the writing quality, and ethical and political relevance. On the basis of this review, I am extremely pleased to award the 2016 Mullins Prize to Monami Badra for her paper, Nation-Building Civic Epistemologies in India Through Nuclear Politics. Monami recently defended her PhD at Arizona State University in the Human and Social Dimensions of Science and Technology program, and is currently just started a postdoctoral fellowship based at The Ohio State University in the Department of Comparative Studies. The paper that Monami submitted is part of her dissertation, which focused on the contemporary politics over nuclear power in India, particularly the politics of knowledge around the rise of anti-nuclear activism, in order to gain a better understanding of the meanings and practices of Indian democracy. In order to produce this work, she did extensive fieldwork in India, including interviews, ethnographic work, and document collection. Monami's paper is essentially an abstract of the larger issues that she addresses in the dissertation. And in doing so, she tries to make sense of the multiple political and epistemic forms that have emerged with India's pursuit of nuclear power. As India gained independence in the middle of the 20th century, nuclear power was seen as central to the new country's future and inspired enormous scientific, technological, and political investment. It was a national and nation-building project. But today, Badra argues, we see a fractious political and epistemic landscape. She points us to peaceful women protesters, the Tamil fishermen and boys who link arms around a partially built reactor to prevent further constructions, and many other moments of resistance. And she contrasts this with the sedate politics that we find in parliamentary debates and Supreme Court hearings over nuclear safety and liability. And looking at these contrasting politics, she asks, how should we understand these fractious politics? Can we talk about collectively held national rationalities, anchoring public debate around nuclear power in a socially heterogeneous country? Who are the publics bound by these existing modes of contestation? And in asking these questions, she interrogates the concepts that's been developed by Sheila Jasanoff and her colleagues of civic epistemology, the idea that there are highly institutionalized and patterned forms of contestation and deliberation through which the public can make claims to the government about technological trajectories. In reading Mon Ami's piece, we decided to award the Mullins Prize to her for a few reasons. The first is that it is an extraordinarily, almost lyrically written paper. The second is that this piece is very important to our understandings of the politics of science, technology, and development in younger democracies. And essentially, Mon Ami interrogates the notion of civic epistemology and calls our attention to, I think, something that's very important for our studies of STS as a whole, which is that our concepts, of course, like the concepts that we study in science and technology, are based on the case studies that we do, the research that we do. And so Mon Ami asks whether and how the concept of civic epistemology is essentially produced by the fact that the concept was developed by analyses in Western democracies, and asks whether or not it fits in the Indian context. And as a result, then, it forces us to think more broadly about the contexts and the bases on which our STS concepts are produced. In sum, I am very pleased to award this to Mon Ami. Congratulations.
Okay, and then I'd like to ask Claire Waterton to tell us about this year's Carson Prize.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
So, hello everyone. I've had the great pleasure this year of chairing the 4S.
Double mic there.
2016 Carson Prize Committee, and working with my colleagues Abby Kinchi, Zulfikar Amir, and Yvonne da Costa Marquez to allocate this year's prize. The 4S Carson Prize is awarded each year for an outstanding book-length work of social or political relevance in science and technology studies. It's inspired, of course, by the writings of Rachel Carson, in particular her book Silent Spring, which was published in 1962, and which demonstrated the political potential of scientific work. The 4S Carson Prize is awarded to a book that similarly opens out the political potential of STS empirical and theoretical work. So I'm delighted to present and to congratulate the winner of this 4S Carson Prize to Gabrielle Hecht for her book, Being Nuclear, Africans and the Global Uranium Trade, published by MIT Press. I'll say a little bit about why the book won the prize. This book stood out among its 67 contenders for its exceptional empirical and theoretical scholarship, combined with its profound political messages for nuclear and so-called non-nuclear states across the globe. So I'll say a little bit about the empirical and the theoretical contributions. Empirically speaking, Gabrielle, I think, was trained as a historian, and this is seen throughout the book in her forensic quest and treatment of evidence, I think. Her fieldwork took her, and I believe parts of her family, to uranium mine sites in Gabon, Madagascar, South Africa, Namibia, as well as Australia and the USA. She collected more than 50,000 pages of archival material, a true historian, and she conducted 138 interviews, literally across the globe, in order to understand uranium markets, uranium mines, and the conditions of uranium mine workers in African mines. What's really notable, he thought, was the skillful way in which Gabrielle leads us through this rich and large amount of empirical material, with a strong and revealing theoretical framing concerning how things such as mines or markets are made nuclear, how they gain what Gabrielle calls nuclearity. Gabrielle deftly shows us how this status of being or becoming nuclear is rendered in different sites and at different times as either an exceptional nuclearity, and therefore something requiring action or infrastructure or agitation, or conversely as something quite banal, a banal nuclearity. And Gabrielle showed us exactly how this matters for issues of ontology, nuclear ontology, for issues of commodification and markets, for issues of colonialism, marginality and invisibility, issues of politics, labour, bodies and work, injustices, inequalities, and also looking towards the price of change, the price of making this different. So the book absolutely has social and political relevance, as the Carson Prize demands. The stakes, as Gabrielle put it in her book, in the global uranium trade are high and are accumulating. So, Gabrielle, thank you very much for a wonderful book and congratulations on this prize.
Okay, thank you. And then I would like to invite Gabrielle and Mon Ami to have an exchange.
Do you want to? We didn't plan who would start.
No, we didn't do that.
No, we didn't do that part.
Okay, no.
Let's start with Mon Ami. With Mon Ami asking or with Mon Ami answering?
Why don't I think Mon Ami should start with your question. Okay. So as I was wandering through Barcelona, of course, in non-conference hours, and
it's good to say that.
yes, and I had never seen it.
And I think it was, it could have been many different things. I could have gone down, I could have written much more than I did about the communities in Namibia or Gabon or Madagascar that I looked at. There are many other roads I could have gone down. I let my sources speak to me, and it was about 6 or 7 years into the project when I realized that the material on markets and commodification was that sources were making claims about what wasn't nuclear and about place, and that I was finding the same kinds of claims, structurally speaking, being made in the material around occupational health. And it was when I kind of realized what this parallel was, that I decided that would be the thread and not the millions of other threads that I could have pursued. But I have a very undisciplined mind, and I couldn't let go of those other things. And so the way I handled the excess was by being very obnoxious with my press editor and insisting on two things. One, that each substantive chapter in the middle of the book had to have a prologue, and that this wasn't part of the chapter, and that the point of the prologue was to point in all of these excessive directions that I couldn't go in. And that similarly, each prologue had to have a photograph that I now know is called a full bleed, that goes to the edge of the page to kind of suggest as well that there is much more to the picture than can be framed in a single image. And that, I don't know if it worked or not, but it made me feel better about my ultimate total inability to get a real grasp on all of this material, and the fact that I could only use really a sliver of those 50,000 pages. So, but Mon Ami, your material is really also it's super rich. It's very easy to see how this is going to explode into a book. And I thought, no, in a good way. That's a good thing, right? That's a good thing. I don't mean to discourage her. So just as a way of giving these patient people a sense of what your argument is, beyond the wonderful description that Shobita gave us, one of the nice moments in your papers, you take us through an environmental impact assessment process. And what you're arguing there is that the process itself is structured to be exclusionary, so that it's masquerading as democracy, but really the whole way that it functions excludes all kinds of people. And you use two really nice phrases in making this argument. One is epistemological dissonance, and the other is scientific innocence. And so I was wondering if you could just, via those two phrases, unpack a little bit for us your argument about how it is that these debates about nuclear power in India really are debates about Indian democracy and what it means, what democracy means in an Indian setting.
Sure, thank you. So the first time I heard the phrase scientifically innocent, I was in an interview where I thought the interview was going terrible. It was with one of the environmental impact assessment architects, and he was very much throwing up all these boundaries because I wasn't trained in nuclear physics. I was a woman, and so I kind of played the "oh, I'm not that smart" card, and I got him to open up a bit, and it actually worked. Older Indian man, but he. Not that all Indian men do this, but that one in particular did.
Older nuclear types have a way of doing that.
Yes. And when he was describing the villagers, in one breath, he described them as seditionists who were waging war against the state, and also scientifically innocent. And so I was kind of taken aback by that, and pressed him on it. And this came to be a phrase that was repeated by a lot of nuclear experts, thinking of the villagers, people who were fighting displacement from their lands to build these nuclear infrastructures and reactors, as scientifically innocent, as in they were just sort of. They knew their own. They were very superstitious and backward, and were being corrupted by outside influences who were teaching them the wrong kind of science. So from that phrase, it sort of encapsulated for me how the Indian state views, especially the contrast between being a seditionist and being scientifically innocent, the two modes in which these publics are being brought into being are being created, and the kinds of politics that the state uses to try to control or suppress different publics in India. And so to build a civic epistemology, it really needs a common rationality of sorts, and this is an exclusionary process by which the state can justify its actions to the public, and the public can hold the state accountable. And in a very narrowly constrained way, that certainly is the case. You have debates over nuclear liability in India, in which the question is around should we import reactors or not. It's very much tied together and bound together under the imaginary of Indian sovereignty and self-reliance. But outside that sphere, especially and there's such a multiplicity of voices. I talk about the relationships between urban activists and different groups of people, but the urban activists want a more science-based rationality to have these kinds of relationships, and villagers want something different. But the sense that there is such a multiplicity and fragmented landscape where it's not about what kind of reactor that's going to be built or what kind of technology. It's not even about risk or health and safety hazards, but all the other things that come with nuclear power, such as the fear of a lot of women who fear that they will be assaulted because of migrant laborers who come. There are migrant labor politics. There are the ways in which they connect to other industries. So there's such a multiplicity of voices that there's, I've been thinking of that in terms of epistemological dissonance. The expectations of how these groups think the state should behave based on either past experience or how they think that they're kind of culturally thinking that the state should behave. It's not happening that way. And so I thought that was sort of how I've been thinking about, understanding the competing processes in which democracy is being formed in India.
Lovely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both for that wonderful round. And we have to move on. Okay, and last but not least, can I ask Kaushik Sundarajan and Maya Horst, I think, as our presenters of the Forest Mentoring and East Simon Awards. And then could I ask Ari Rip and the collective representing the Simon Award to come to the stage.
Yes.
It's the Dutch again, yeah. Oh, okay. Okay, and Kaushik, would you like to start with the mentoring award?
So the Forest Mentoring Award is an attempt on the part of Forest to recognize contributions that go beyond publication, contributions that often go unrecognized, but that are absolutely essential to the constitution of the field and to generations of scholarship. This is the second year that the Mentoring Award is being given, and I would like to thank the members of the committee, the co-chair Sharon Trawick, Kim Fortune, Sally Wyatt, Leandro Medina, and Zulfikar Amin. We are delighted to announce the award of the 2016 Mentoring Award to Professor Ari Rip, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Science and Technology, University of Twente, the Netherlands. Professor Rip has been a formative figure in STS for over 4 decades. He has helped shape the field both through his own scholarship and through the mentoring of generations of STS scholars. He has supervised over 50 PhD students in his career, in addition to numerous master's degree students. He has coached and supported many others at various times in their career, even while not credited with a formal advisory role. His mentoring has been a model of attentive listening and constructive criticism, and has continued for a decade beyond his formal retirement from teaching. His mentoring has extended beyond supporting individual students and early career scholars into important institutional directions. He was a key figure in the science, technology, and society movements of the 1970s that led to the teaching and training of STS-related issues in science and engineering departments in Northwest Europe and the United States. He created innovative courses for science and engineering students at the University of Twente, directed the societal aspects of nanotechnology sub-program of the Dutch National R&D Consortium NanoNet, and chaired the expert advisory group on science with and for society and responsible research and innovation in the European Union's framework program Horizon 2020. He was also one of the founders of the Netherlands Graduate Research School for Science, Technology, and Modern Culture, which has been providing PhD training for almost 30 years and about which we've already heard something about today. In short, Ari Rip has helped establish a new field, developed institutional and pedagogical infrastructures for STS in its relationship to both engineering and policy, and has trained generations of scholars. We feel privileged to award him the 2016 Forest Mentoring Award.
Okay, and Maya, the Simon Award.
Yes, thank you. So on behalf of the East Council, it's with great pleasure that I can announce that the 2016 East Simon Award for a collaborative promotion of public interaction with science and technology is made to the Leiden Manifesto. And by that we mean both the declaration, the website, and the international network that goes with it. But the recipients are Dinah Hicks, Paul Wouters, Ludo Waldman, Sarah de Rieke, and Ismail Rafals. The Leiden Manifesto is an initiative to engage with the rise of metrics-based research assessment by articulating a set of principles which draw on the insights of STS. It addresses a broad audience of evaluators who are often tasked with the role of assessing research performance with the ultimate goal of ensuring public accountability. The manifesto represents a serious and successful public-facing interpretation of the technical area of metrics which is understandable by a wide audience. It draws on state-of-the-art knowledge of research metrics and is linked to an extensive range of international projects, publications, conferences, workshops, and networks. The initiative is designed to influence evaluation practice rather than simply to critique it. It has thus developed a specialized discussion into a broad political conversation. Research evaluation is often treated in a technocratic and managerial fashion. But this initiative promotes a more reflexive approach within an understanding that metrics are an important part of research and innovation policy. It also provides direct and useful guidance to managers in the research and university sector, such as myself, and I have actually greatly benefited from reading that in my other role as head of department, so thank you for that. So, in conclusion, the Leiden Manifesto is an initiative which resonates brilliantly with the Simon tradition of speaking to a broad interdisciplinary audience on an issue with public and/or political significance. And I want to congratulate you warmly on receiving the prize today.
Okay, and Ari, if there's anything that you have left to say to these people that you haven't had a chance to say, I would invite you to do that.
Well, you start, Sarah.
Okay. Congratulations on behalf of the five of us. There's actually one Dutch researcher that is actually not here, Ludo Hoogman and Diane Hicks. I would like to mention that it's really a collective. Congratulations on winning the mentoring award. So obviously by pairing those two awards, we started to think about the relationships between mentoring and assessing. So we would be really interested to hear your thoughts on the role of evaluation and metrics in mentoring junior researchers, and also increasingly in an unprotected landscape, research landscape. So you coined that term, I think.
Yeah, I started thinking about that because I've been looking at metrics and the rise of metrics and how they work out in some of my own work, but hadn't realized what I was then actually doing about it in my mentoring. So you reminded me of that part of the story, and I realized that I have actually been doing, over the years, been doing two things. One is trying to convey the idea that this increasing role of metrics is something like a game that we all play, forced by others sometimes sort of contributing to the continuation of the game, because we were doing things within the framework of those games. So, in a sense, you could say this is a game, the whole metric stuff, that we are creating ourselves, playing together collectively, and in a sense are prisoners of it. Sometimes self-chosen, sometimes we profit from it, sometimes we're just victims, as it were. So I wanted to convey that sort of thinking to my students, that there was this game out there, and you can criticize it as an outsider, but you're also part of it. And I mean, and this sort of being imprisoned, which also leads to reproduction of the game, is very visible in some particular instances, like the Shanghai ranking of universities, which is reproduced, its effect and its game character is reproduced all the time because of the way people refer to it. So training my students or letting them understand this dynamic was an important part. But then the other thing was actually training them or helping them to play that game and perhaps do better in that game, but still keeping some sort of reflexivity or some sort of ironic attitude about it. So we wouldn't actually go into the details of the metrics very often, but we did spend a lot of time in these tactical and strategic questions of what sort of journal to publish in and what would be the advantages and disadvantages. This whole thing of trying to go for a sort of top-level journal, which isn't so important in STS perhaps, or didn't wasn't so important in STS. Maybe it will be coming, but in some other areas that I've been involved with, like business studies, it's very, very important. I mean, people have these lists and they tick off in how many of the top journals each of them has published, and so they keep the whole game in place. I think some people pick up the message very easily. Others of my students and my people that I have helped to develop, and others sort of think of it as a little trick that they can then use. It's okay. And I do have a question in return, of course. And given this sort of overall perspective that I just outlined, and looking at the manifesto, which is very well crafted, and it's also the fact that it's published in Nature is very important, of course. So it's a very good piece of work. It deserves to be awarded and recognized for what it is by East and now also 4S in a sense. But what I didn't see in the manifesto is whether you actually considered why it's being reproduced all the time, why it continues. And that's not just external drivers like an accountability society. It's actually part of the actions of the various players of the game. And so I thought that maybe you could actually have, I don't know whether it could be done in this particular piece, but somehow create an additional set of advices in which the reflexivity of the whole thing, where you think about what's happening to you and what you can do, and perhaps have advice which helps to make the reproduction of the game less naive.
Yeah, okay, well, that's fantastic. I don't even know what to add to that. Yeah, but okay. You want? I did. I did have an answer. But it was sort of in this direction. I will let him speak as well, briefly. No, just kidding. No, there's a special issue coming out on this shortly, but. I guess the frictions and also the game and the enticement of the game, you just pointed out, it's very relevant. Many of us are experts in analyzing these dynamics, and we're part of this game. We are sometimes loving playing this game, but STS as a professional community has remained rather silent on this, to be honest. And there may be good reasons for that, and there may be a lot of back-channel activity that a lot of us don't see. But the five of us, of course, we are extremely happy with this award, and we sincerely hope that this manifesto is also a starting point for some of those more front stage activities in our community. So we hope that that will also happen.
No, I don't know. We don't have any answers for going beyond, but there was, in one of the sub-plenaries, an anonymous meeting of conspirators. I don't know if some of you were there. They were with the V of Vendetta mask, so we don't know who they were. But they came up with a list of to-do things, such as publishing without names, but in collectives, such as citing without journals, citing to the archives. And this is, I know that Vincenzo Pavone, who's one of the organizers, took some of the notes of the anonymous meeting, and there might be some follow-up. And this was sort of grassroots STS insurrection to follow.
Yes. That, I never trust last words. No, well, I do indeed think that that it's very interesting. Well, actually, it relates to also the work by Mike. So this is a very interesting session, actually, because I see all sorts of connections, both on the political side and on the fact of how material practices and symbolic representations are interacting. And the big thing, of course, is that it's not only about metrics, it's also about how do we evaluate, how do we give value to particular types of work, what is made invisible, what is made less important. It's a big political game in which also some disciplines try to sit on top of other disciplines. And this can sometimes also be threatening for STS, even if it sometimes in the short term seems profitable. So we should always distrust these kind of things, I guess. But it's also true we're not innocent. We do it ourselves, as Strathern has shown in many ways. So it's very interesting for me to see a very intimate connection between scientometrics and anthropology. So the most qualitative and the most quantitative, they seem to be separate. It's not true. They're very intimately connected every time, every day in daily life. And that's a nice thing, I think, of the Leiden Manifesto experiment. Anyway, no last word, but...
Thank you all very much. Okay, now, just to make it clear that you shouldn't leave quite yet, we have one more very, very, very important thing to do. And that is a few thank yous. And so we're going to start with our program officer, Wes Schramm. No, you have to come get your flowers. He thought he was buying them for someone else, of course. So. Oh, and I guess we should also someday find out from Ari how he did with his mentees up there in that photograph. Thank you, Wes. We'll finish. We'll do the full rounds, but I now want to yet again attempt to thank our local Barcelona organizing team. As you all can tell, this was just an extraordinary achievement to put this conference together. We have for each of them something to drink and something to read while they drink. So each of you will be getting a certificate, which is effectively an IOU for the 4th Handbook of STS, which will be reimbursed in December in the form of a book as soon as they're out in print. So I just want to read out the names and ask you to come up to the front with us. So we have Nerea Calvillo, and forgive my pronunciation, and Thomas Criado, and Mikel Dominic, and Danielle Lopez Gomez, and Vincenzo Pavone, and Israel Rodriguez Giralt, and Carmen Romero Bachiller, and Francisco Tirado, and also Miriam, if you're here, Miriam Arinas, and Rosia Tovar. Woo-hoo! Reassure you, there are more bottles in the corner, so we'll finish that distribution. Yes, thank you so much. We know that you had no idea what you were getting into when you agreed to do this, and I would say this is the most really, truly extraordinarily inventive, impassioned, lively, wonderful conference that we have held in our long history of conferences. So thank you so, so, so much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. This is for you. This is one of the STS. And the other is for Fred. Where's Fred? Just a few words. It's been a collective effort, as you can see, and we are very proud of it, that it's been a collective, that have been working as a collective, and have done a collective conference. And also, I must say that we are happy. We are very happy because all the reactions we have been collecting during these days in the conference have been quite positive, and that's makes us to be very proud. But in some sense, we feel we just offer a proposal, and you have taken that proposal, you have made this proposal yours, and this is your success in some sense. I mean, as you have made a big and nice conference, and we really want to thank you to be here, to help us, and to contribute to this collective effort. Thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah, so I also want to thank all the graduate students, as we call them, or postgraduates, as we call them, depending on which side of the Atlantic you are, who organized the fabulous day-long postgraduate workshop before the conference. And again, thank all of you. Please come to Boston in 2017. Among other things, there will be a grand revival of the Making and Doing